So Herodotus was born of the city-state Halicarnassus in the region of Caria, known in modern times as Bodrum, which is on the Aegean coast of Turkey. The ancient biographers place Herodotus's date of birth at 484 BC, but this date, like most aspects of Herodotus's life, can't be for certain. We know very little concerning the life of Herodotus, the man whom Cicero declared the pater historiae, the father of history. Nevertheless, some facts do exist concerning our enigmatic writer. Herodotus's birthplace, Halicarnassus, was a culturally and linguistically Greek city. It was founded some 500 years before the historian's birth. For 3/4 of a century before Herodotus's time, the polis was placed under the yoke of Persian domination, where it lay at the very western fringe of an empire whose administrative center was a 3 months' journey to the east. Herodotus and his family are known to have been active in the politics of their polis. This precarious occupation, however, may well have led to his exile in the island of Samos sometime in the 450s. In exile, Herodotus traveled widely, though to what regions exactly, I'm not exactly sure. It's likely he eventually settled in Thurii in southern Italy, where perhaps he ended his life. It's believed that during his life of travels, he settled for a time to write in Athens. This can almost be confirmed as a fact, as his descriptions of the Attic polis are strikingly detailed and clear, described from the view of a man who must have truly known the city. We can't even be certain about when he began writing, though his histories were likely published in the 420s, which would mean that Herodotus was writing a full 6 or 7 decades after the last events which transpired in his narrative. This information is fundamentally all we really know about the details of Herodotus's life, though much more concerning his character can be extrapolated from his text. So, when considering influences, we shouldn't divorce Herodotus from his most important influence, his own times and his surrounding cultural climate. In the 6th century BC, the region of Ionia in which Herodotus was born underwent a period of intellectual and political change which has come to be known as the Ionian Enlightenment. In 499 to 494 BC, several Ionian city-states rebelled against their Persian overlords, but these attempts were crushed. The region was re-subjugated, and the atmosphere of intellectual ferment among the works of the logographers moved westward to mainland Greece. This would have crucial consequences on the Hellenic world and the mind and biases of Herodotus himself. The major known writers which either supplied Herodotus with a frame of inquiry or information concerning exotic locales, especially Egypt, as it's described in Book 2, were those of the logographers, who emerged out of the Ionian Enlightenment and its Milesian school. The two most important of these writers were Anaximander, who influenced Herodotus's interests in geography, geology, and meteorology, and Hecataeus of Miletus, who influenced Herodotus's views on cartography, geography, ethnography, mythology, and legend in his genealogies. Neither of these writers are explicitly acknowledged or cited by Herodotus, and as such, much debate has surrounded the question of the extent of his indebtedness to them. The logographers were originally unique in their understanding of the natural world and the events which transpired therein. Knowing the cause of things, from scientific phenomena to historical events, lay at the center of their works in the same sense as it did for Herodotus. Two definitive goals are set down by Herodotus from the outset of his histories, and I'll quote him. Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiry, so that 1. Human achievements may not become forgotten in time, and great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some displayed by barbarians, may not be without their glory, and especially 2. To show why these two people fought with each other. The latter of these objectives is borrowed directly from the tradition of the logographer, while the former objective is borrowed from epic. It would be a grave mistake to overlook the influence of Homer when looking at the very style and subject matter of Herodotus's histories. In the most basic of comparisons, Homer and Herodotus alike took the oral material accessible to them and, with the use of writing, reworked their contents into a new and unique literary form. The purpose of the histories was in part akin to that of epic, that is, to record the deeds and to preserve the kleos, or glory, of great men. Retrospectively, Herodotus's accounts of the Persian wars would recast the Trojans of Homer's epic as orientalized barbarians, and then the Achaean expedition as the first of many victories of the West over the Orient. Such a perception, of course, wasn't shared by Homer and would later have dire ramifications in Europe's collective understanding of the so-called East for 1,000 years to come. Herodotus had a political rationale for the demarcation between Greeks and barbarians. The term barbarian for Herodotus came to signify not primarily barbarism in the sense of cruelty, excess, or laxity, but rather in political otherness. His dichotomy separated those who lived in poleis from those who managed to never get along without kings ruling over them. So in his mind, the Greek is political, or free, while the barbarian is royal, meaning submissive. Regardless, while Herodotus may have hoped to rival Homeric epic, the divine muses who saw and knew all were no longer around for consultation. The logographer's process of inquiry was now the only path through which the past might be recovered. Herodotus's only extant work is the Histories, a 9-book exploration of the conflict between the Greek poleis and the Persian Empire from the 6th century to 478 BC. The ancient Greek world of Herodotus's time wasn't unified in any political sense, but rather consisted of scattered city-states strewn about the Mediterranean. Greek language, religious practices, and culture were the main unifying forces which held the Greeks together. This, however, obviously didn't preclude conflict and wars between the individual Greek poleis. When modern readers consider his works, this detail is vital, as the histories gain a whole new level of interest, since they're an account in which the whole Greek world was united for the very first time against an invading foreign power. Herodotus's most important contribution to the historical tradition is that he not only described events, but attempted to explain their causes. These were causes that could be traced back for generations. The opening sentence of Herodotus's Histories is a succinct indicator of what he intends to do throughout his work. Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiry so that human achievements may not become forgotten in time, and the great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by barbarians, may not be without their glory, and especially to show why these two people fought with each other. Unlike Thucydides, Herodotus makes no claims to have been present at any of the chief events described in the Histories. The writer rather recorded his dialogues with people who had been there. To answer his political inquiries, Herodotus wrote down what was conveyed to him by the locals. The very first and most fundamental of Herodotus's questions was, what had caused the Greeks and non-Greeks to go to war? He then strove to build up a narrative from the reports of key individuals, or from an ill-defined body of information, such as the members of a specific polis or region. Herodotus accounts for what was told to him by Greek speakers in a wide range of distant lands. When at all possible, he chose to rely on what he could see for himself and then investigate, and when the circumstances were favorable, Herodotus was able to find documents for which he could draw information, such as the evidence he gives concerning the satrapy system established by Darius to govern his empire. Epistemologically speaking, The Greeks always prized seeing over hearing as a way of knowing. To see for oneself and to know for oneself were one and the same thing. Herodotus himself is famously quoted saying, "Men trust their ears less than their eyes." In the latter half of his work, Herodotus increasingly relies on the use of speeches to sketch out the details of the Persian wars. Up until the account of the Ionic revolt, the instances of direct speech found in the first books of the histories are fairly anecdotal. They're more or less exclusively used to point out remarkable developments or stress unusual thoughts or witticisms. The near absence of speeches in the earlier books, 1 to 6, is well contrasted by their frequent use in books 7 to 9. Since the nature and assortment of literary materials in Book 1 to 6 may have precluded the need for such compositions, the reasons for this exclusion may have been merely stylistic. Nevertheless, another likely explanation does exist. Herodotus's speeches in the later books are, as one scholar puts it, a means of passing judgments, conveying opinions, and, in short, of interpreting the events which he reports. If this is the case, the relative inconsistency on the topics covered in the earlier books, in addition to their distance from Herodotus's own experience, may have prevented the formulation of opinions which he could have concerning the more recent or tangible events. Herodotus could have well overtly interspersed his own personal remarks and commentary throughout his narrative. However, this method is hardly appealing from an artistic point of view. Herodotus penned his history primarily as a work of art, and personal remarks, in addition to the already numerous number of digressions, would have undoubtedly interrupted the artistic flow of his account. Herodotus must then instead borrow from one of the few styles of literature which he's well acquainted with, and that's Homeric epic, in which the number of individual speeches abounds. In general, much of the nobility, simplicity, and honesty of the Homeric speech is also found in Herodotus. It is a well-known fact that the recording of history didn't begin in the 5th century in Greece, but rather it began much earlier in Egypt, where royal continuity was critical to rulers. We have royal lists of inscribed pictograms on tablets which date back to the beginning of the Bronze Age, and from later, their compilations on papyrus. The purpose of these Egyptian annals, however, were merely to keep record of the deeds of the pharaohs. There was little room for personal inquiry. Herodotus would then revolutionize the methods of quote-unquote doing history by constructing a process of inquiry throughout his narrative. This pursuit of historia in the form of a humanistic yet relatively objective investigation of events, material objects, institutions, texts, human behaviors, etc., in order to understand their relevance on the development of mankind, was an entirely new idea in human history. In other words, he believed one shouldn't only relate his collection of sources, including their agreements and disagreements, but more importantly, he related whether or not he believed what he was being told. Quote, "My business is to record what people say," wrote Herodotus, "but I am by no means bound to believe it, and that may be taken to apply to this book as a whole." End quote. If Herodotus was unable to decide, or if his inquiries were unanswerable because they lay beyond the reach of human memory, or beyond the limits of his travels, then he was obliged to relate it to the reader. The first step beyond the mere narrative was presumably taken by Herodotus. He was also the first to focus his narratives on describing the events of an exclusively recent past, rather than that of a mythic one. For Herodotus, history wasn't poetry, and this understanding would usher in a new way of writing historical narrative, one which distanced itself from epic and moved towards humanistic prose. Fables and myths were the territory of drama and epic, not of history. Following in the tradition set down by Herodotus of Miletus, Herodotus acknowledges a clear, distinguished boundary between a mythical past and a recent past. That isn't to say Herodotus disbelieved the stories of the mythic past. They were simply outside both the scope of his narrative and beyond his ability to prove with evidence. Herodotus reinforced his grand overarching histories with clusters of smaller peripheral plots, often, but perhaps erroneously called, the Herodotian digression. These side narratives were expressed in rich detail and sometimes told from the perspective of Herodotus himself. He generally, though not always, tied them together in chronological succession in order to examine the patterns of cause and effect. Though modern readers are often shocked by the breadth and scope of the Herodotian digressions, they would have been considered integral to the history's overall cohesion. Herodotus's vast narrative is driven by an unfolding process of dialectic. The assumption that an eye for an eye system of reciprocity is inherent in human behavior lays at the very foundation of Herodotus's work. The demands of reciprocity, in Herodotus's view, are so absolute that they transcend time and are passed down hereditarily. Therefore, a chain of reciprocity may reach back for centuries and encompass people of many strange and distant lands. The search for a beginning is the ultimate aim of Herodotus, but perhaps such a thing lies beyond what the realm of historical inquiry may tell.